Good morning, everybody. We're just watching everybody pile into this seminar. I can see the participant numbers rising exponentially from across the country as we wait. So we'll just give it a couple of seconds to get you all in before we kick off here this morning. That's it. Okay, we're at the still piling in. Yep. Excellent. Okay, let's kick off, and there are people still joining. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Roythornes Fisher German joint session on renewable energy. What can I do about it? How can I get the best out of it? So the aim of this session, from our point of view and from the questions that have come in, is to give some pointers about how you can get the best out of renewable energy opportunities that are out there in the market. It's a practical session, and we've got 4 panel members who are all experienced practitioners working on deals as we speak. In fact, it was quite difficult to get them to carve out the time to do this session for us. Such are the number of deals on the table at the moment. Couple of housekeeping points. We would very much welcome questions from you, and there is a Q&A facility and a chat facility. If you could possibly put them in the question and answer facility, that would be great. Pop them in there, and we will try to come to you and unmute you so that you can actually ask your question or ask a supplementary and explore the issue with the panelists. The tech does allow that, so we'll give that a go. So please do jump in this morning and make this as lively as possible. We will finish at 11:30, sorry, 11:30 at the latest. But if we've covered everything by then, dealt with questions, we'll finish before then. And I don't imagine there'll be any complaints from you about that. So we have audience participants from around the country, and in fact the panelists are from around the country, and in some ways that's the beauty of Zoom, even post-COVID, when we can actually have meetings. In the audience, we've got a mix of practitioners who are also old hands, experienced, and may want to pitch in and make a comment, and feel free to do that, or ask a question. And we have farmers and landowners who we know are interested, and we assume are interested in the opportunities that renewable energy projects offer. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take a basic line, which is to walk you through a potential approach and transaction, what you need to look out for, etc., in a very practical way. I'd like to kick off, though, because it is a very good question to ask, really, whether renewable energy is the place to be and the hot topic. And it seemed to, in some ways, I could see, in my own experience, that there was a dip of interest, particularly in solar and onshore wind, towards the late 2010s. And the question really is, is everything full steam ahead now? And I'm going to ask our first panelist, Darren Edwards from Fisher Germans. First of all, Darren, just say who you are and what you spend your time doing. And then if you could just sort of give an idea of, the potential in the market, whether we're wasting our time, whether it's something to really have a serious look at.
Thanks very much, Julian. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think so. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Darren Edwards. I head up the sustainable energy team within Fisher German, and we, as a business, we've been involved in the sector now for well over 20 years. And yeah, what a sort of roller coaster ride it's been, as Julie alluded to there, really. there's been a lot of change, both in terms of sort of focus and policy, and a lot of sort of practical change in the market. But that change has created lots of opportunities along the way, and opportunities are invariably driven by either sort of policy and personal circumstances. We know there's a lot of pressure, mounting pressure to decarbonize energy supplies. That's been there for sort of some time now. The government has introduced policies over that period to help sort of stimulate activity in the market. So we've seen the renewables obligation, we've seen the feed-in tariff scheme, and the RH and the renewable heat incentive scheme, but those have now gone. So what is the sort of what is driving the market now, and what is going to sort of drive it going forward, and what is going to create the opportunities out there? Well, sort of looking back to what's happened over the last 18 months, obviously, the world has been shrouded by what's going on with sort of COVID. But in 2020, you might recall the government launched the 10-point green recovery plan. That was the sort of first guide that we had within the industry as to what the future might hold. And then that was really sort of backed up by the more important and the more sort of prominent policy now, which is the government's UK net zero strategy, which is all about sort of building back greener. So that is built on the 10-point green recovery plan, and really is the direction of travel over the next 30 years as we build up to 2050 and that net zero target. And what the government said out of that is that there's going to be £90 billion worth of investment over the next, or by 2030, so over the next 8 years. And I guess for us and for you guys listening, where that money is going to go is going to be a big driver of where the activity and where the opportunities are. So just briefly sort of recapping on that, as part of that, that £90 billion investment, £3.9 billion has been pledged for new funding to reduce carbon intensive heating requirements. So that's going to have a big impact on domestic consumers and across the property sector. And there's going to be a lot of change there. And we're already seeing this push towards heat pumps and away from oil and gas heating. £140 million towards the industrial decarbonisation and hydrogen revenue support scheme. So that's really to help sort of establish carbon capture clusters. 500 million has been pledged towards innovation projects for the development of green technologies. There's been £350 million been pledged towards the EV supply chain, and a further £620 million targeted towards EV grants and infrastructure. And we'll come on to that later within the session, but obviously we're getting involved in some sort of EV forecourt deals now, and that's an opportunity for clients, particularly if you're located well within the transport network. And then moving away from the actual sort of energy side, £625 million was pledged towards more woodland creation for a tripling of the tree planting rates and for peatland restoration projects. So again, green schemes, again, we'll come on to it later in the session. But Julie, just handing back to you, that's where I'm sort of, policy is obviously going to be a big driver of the opportunities that are out there. And that's what we're looking at, and that's where we're beginning to see opportunities emerge.
Just a quick question on that. Then there's a question come in from John Twidle. Thanks, John. Major factor has been the effective banning of onshore wind turbines. So I think today probably people have joined the session thinking about solar, battery storage, maybe AD possibly, and onshore wind. But what's the position on onshore wind? And actually, let me chuck that to Harry Edwards, who's the other Fisher German valuer and agent who works on renewable projects. Harry, is onshore wind dead?
Hi, Judy. Yeah, as you say, I work in renewables here at Bridgestone. We, as a firm, are involved in several wind farms, or quite a few wind farms, but at the moment they're in Scotland and Wales, and we haven't seen anything in England really. I think we're involved in the last. I think Darren actually managed the last single turbine to go up in this country, as far as I know, and that was a few years ago, Darren, wasn't it? I have actually seen that we have been asked to value or do a due diligence report for a turbine in the north of England. So there are signs that perhaps it's coming back. And actually, we were a little bit disappointed with COP26 because there were rumours that perhaps onshore wind was going to come back and perhaps an announcement would be made. And we've sort of been watching that keenly because it's a sector we were hugely involved in beforehand. And I'm talking about wind farms and also single turbines for farms. And we haven't seen any announcements. And what essentially killed it from perhaps 5-6 years ago was planning guidance that effectively put too much weight on an individual who didn't like the idea of a turbine, and that could kill it. So the planning risk has been too high. Now, Darren, as far as I know, there haven't been any announcements that have said it's coming back in England. We are involved in Scotland and Wales, but we're sort of watching this space because we feel that it has to come back because of all these targets. You know, there's a lot of solar going on and there's offshore wind, but we feel that part of that mix is going to have to be onshore wind. And Darren, can I just check with you? There hasn't been, as far as we know, anything legislation-wise to encourage it.
Yeah, no, you're right, Harry. There hasn't been an announcement. There were sort of murmurings coming out of Westminster in the build up to COP26 that was going to be one of the areas that was going to be sort of opened back up. So it all links back to Eric Pickles in 2015 and the changing of the sort of ministerial statement. But no. So other than Boris coming out and saying that the UK is going to be the sort of Saudi Arabia of wind, but the focus is still very much on offshore wind, Julie. So onshore wind is a quiet market at the moment, other than in Scotland and Wales.
Thanks, guys. Ed, Ed's from the legal side of things, works for Roythornes. Ed, you want to just make a comment on that?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to echo what's been said already. I think that's absolutely right on the wind side on onshore in England, but we are seeing or starting to see some sets of heads of terms where the prospect of wind turbines in the future is something that developers are looking at. So at the moment, we're looking at a scheme, or a couple of schemes actually, where there might be a combination of wind and solar, but it's probably going to be solar first, and the developer wants some flexibility in the future if policy changes. So it's not an immediate issue in terms of it being constructed necessarily in England, but it might be something that comes up when speaking to developers as something they want to try and contract for at the moment. I think, if I can, Julie, just very quickly, my only other point on Darren's sort of opening comments about policy. Obviously, a lot of this is driven by a green agenda and policy changes and government commitments in terms of funding, tax breaks, etc. I think the other thing that's just useful to mention in terms of the dip we saw in these sorts of instructions and transactions, and now the rapid growth in relation to them, is irrespective of policy, they're starting to stack up financially themselves. Yeah. So, as far as I can see from that perspective, there are two sort of contributing factors. There's you've got the policy stuff, but on the commercial side, there's the level of income being derived from them. So energy prices are increasing and energy demand is increasing and is likely to continue to increase as we transition to electric cars, etc., etc. We've got then on the capex side, decreasing costs in terms of actually buying the kit, but also the borrowing costs are low, historically low at the moment. So if you are a fund or pension fund or someone who's got some cash to invest, a developer can get hold of that cash through these sorts of processes or aggregating schemes together at a very low rate. And it is attractive to both parties because the pension fund's getting a yield where they might otherwise not get a yield in a low interest rate market. and the developer is therefore able to borrow large sums at very low sub 1% rates in some instances. So those two, cheaper to build income streams looking stable and increasing in value means that irrespective of policy, subsidy removal, etc., certainly on ground mount solar in England at the moment, the schemes stack up financially.
Great, thanks Ed. And Stuart, Mackenzie came in the question about single stick wind turbines, 225 kilowatts coming on board across Scotland, England and Wales. But I think we've sort of covered the possibilities for wind turbines in the earlier comments from Darren and Harry. Just very quickly before we move on to our sort of case study or walk you through the process. Look, there's for landowners and farmers across England, we can see that there are many messages coming through. Darren, you mentioned woodland creation. We've got biodiversity net gain coming through another channel, and those are sort of pressures on developers, opportunities for landowners. We have a lot of talk. We've heard about rewilding. I just want to ask the question. Yep, there's a lot of steam in the renewable energy market. Is there an opportunity cost element here? So should landowners actually be, when they're thinking of sweating their assets and getting a return on their assets, might woodland be, or rewilding, or indeed creating a biodiversity net gain site be more attractive, or is it too early to say, or case by case? Ed, I'll chuck that one at you as well, because I know you.
Yeah, I think it's case by case, Julie, but it's always an interesting conversation to have. And in fact, I've got a scenario at the moment where we're considering sort of solar versus prospective residential development, for example, which might come forward in the next 20 years. So it's always a case, I think, when we have these conversations about, in some way, you're gambling on that future opportunity versus the opportunity developers presenting, and you may win and you may lose, but it's important that you take into account the opportunities available. And in an ideal world, when we're advising landowners, what we're trying to do is make sure they're making that decision in sort of full knowledge of the risks and reward that are available to them. So yes, we don't know, for example, how biodiversity net gain is necessarily going to develop over time. And the same probably is true with carbon. We do know that there's a market for solar at a certain level per acre. And we do know there's a market potentially for res development or warehousing distribution if you're for trunk road, etc., at a certain level. And we know there are risks involved with all of those. So, I mean, I guess this isn't supposed to be an opportunity for us to say, come to professionals, because that's what you ought to do. But if I owned land, I would want to talk to a land agent to get a bit of a steer about what opportunities were likely to come forward, what the planning policy was. And then I could weigh those things up. But I don't think there's a right answer on that. It'll be site specific. Yep.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ed. Okay, let's get down to brass tacks then. And there you are, just busy doing your daily stuff, ranting on Twitter, drilling, spraying, all the rest of it, organising the estate. And there's a knock on your door. Now, we're very much looking at this from your point of view. All of our panelists have experience of developers as well, so we know what developers need and are interested in. It's very important to get that match between the landowner and the developer. But here we go. There's a knock on your door. And my first question, actually, and it's from a developer wanting you to sign an exclusivity agreement to talk to him about a potential, let's say, the obvious one is solar development. But Harry, can you just sort of give us some idea, before the developer knocks on your door, what work has he done? What does he know about your site that you might not even know, in terms of grid capacity, in terms of potential, etc.? What work's he already done before he knocks on your door?
Well, that depends on the developer, and it's one of the key things that I want to know, actually, if I'm acting for a landowner, or if I was a landowner, is, has this developer actually done his homework prior to approaching me? Because there's a massive difference between how these developers operate and how much work they would have put in. Some will send out letters to everyone, they're sort of fishing letter, hoping to get bites, and they won't have done any research, particularly in that farm or that land. They're just hoping to sort of get an intro and maybe get something signed up quickly. But actually, a lot of the better developers are targeting specific areas, and that essentially is going to be grid-led. These days, they are looking at the grid. There's a certain amount that they can tell from the publicly available data, and they may have, you know, electrical engineers who have experience, who have contacts, and they'll be able to work out a certain amount. But at the end of the day, they don't know. Until they've made a formal grid application, they don't know whether there is a viable grid connection. So grid is the first thing. Traditionally, they would look at the infrastructure, and they might look at, oh, there's 33 kV lines going through the farm. It's changed now, to be honest, Julie. It's changed because the projects have got that much bigger. They're not restricted by subsidies or indeed planning. So they are going larger, and that means that they're often not talking to the local DNO, but they might be talking to National Grid about a much bigger project. And so that's one of the things I would want to know as a landowner is, you know, what scale is this project? Because actually it does open the door. If they're going really large, they could connect 15 miles away. So it actually doesn't necessarily matter if there are wires going through your field. Like in the old days, they would sign up to that specific area. So I think one of the things to answer your question, it's the first thing is, has this developer done their homework? And also what are their track record and what are they looking to do? Often they want a letter of authority signed so they can make a grid application. And then you come into the chicken and egg issue about who we sign before, you know. So it's about homework.
Good. I'm going to just drop in right away there, and you've mentioned a letter of authority, Harry, and you're experienced in the business. I'm going to come to Mary, our fourth panelist, who's on the Roythornes legal team, and say, Mary, signing a letter of authority, what is it, and you know, what does it commit? You know, are you committed to the deal? How far along does it take you?
Yes, so a letter of authority is effectively authority from the landowner for that developer party to make an application to the grid on their land. And it often comes into play at heads of term stage or even prior to heads of term stage. And that's also the point at which the exclusivity would also be signed up. That would be a legally binding part of the heads of terms. So it's really careful. We've had scenarios in the past where developers have kind of come in and talk to a landowner, and as Harry says, you may have multiple developers kind of trying their luck on landowners and landowners looking to try and get the best deal, of course, and then getting themselves into situations where they've signed multiple heads of terms and then problems with breaching exclusivity and letters of authority saying that one developer's got the authority and they've given that away to many parties. So it's coming back to the always speak to an agent to make sure that we can advise on kind of experiences with particular developers and making sure that there's no pitfalls around signing yourself up to too many developers in that way.
Great, thanks. While Harry is sorting out his microphone or Wi-Fi connection, Harry, which is, you're dipping in and out, that's a difficulty, and I'm not sure. While you're doing that, let me just come to Darren and talk about, Harry mentioned kind of more than one landowner being involved, so multiple site agreements. I don't have a clear idea really at which point the developer liaises and tells you and gives you that information, but you know, can you just talk about the issues with multi-site agreements, and you know, how does everyone get on board in that?
Yeah, sure, Julie. Yeah, just finishing off actually on the letter of authority point before I start on the multi-landowner thing is the two key things are before signing a letter of authority is firstly to check the credibility of the developer, as Harry alluded to, track record, can they actually deliver what they're suggesting they can. The other thing as well is what we would always encourage a landowner to do is ask for, you know, if they haven't already provided them as part of the approach, ask for what the indicative terms are, because the letter of authority puts the power of the grid connection into that applicants' hands, and you lose some of your negotiating leverage when it comes to further down the line. If you grant them that authority to investigate the grid, they receive the grid offer that gives them that authority. So that's a key point.
So would you want to, would the landowner want to think seriously about making the application himself? And isn't that a costly, potentially costly process?
Yeah, it is costly nowadays. As Harry said, you can find out a certain amount of information through the sort of the district network operator heat maps that they all publish online. However, until you actually submit the application, then you're not going to get a sort of formal response on that. I guess the difficulty is, Julie, is that you have to know what you're applying for. So if you're going to, in terms of size of connection, type of technology, you need to know the specifics for the purpose of the grid connection application. So that's where it starts becoming complicated and potentially expensive, because you would need someone to come in and sort of design that scheme, if you like. But I'll come back to your multi-landowner because that is a good one, and we are seeing it. I'm actually involved in a wind farm scheme at the moment in South Wales, which is because a lot of the good sites have already been developed out under the renewables obligation or the feed-in tariff. Now developers are beginning to look at sites that are more complicated, and that can be complicated from a stakeholder perspective, i.e. Sort of grid or planning or aviation, whatever it may be. However, from a scale and getting a site together that's big enough to accommodate a large scale renewable energy scheme, it can involve more than one landowner. And there it's a case of really understanding the role of each party. Are they there to just have panels on their land, or just have a wind turbine on their land, or are they providing the access, or are they providing an easement for the grid? So it's a case of actually getting to the nitty-gritty of the sort of the design of the scheme. And then my view has always been you've got to be transparent with the parties and sort of say, well, designing a scheme on paper is very different to how it may turn out in reality. So it's important to explain to landowner clients that things will evolve and things will change, and making them understand the impact commercially that can have for them.
Darren, we've got a question. Mark, who's handling the technology behind our scenes, we've got a question in from Peter Jones. Peter, we're going to unmute you so that you can ask your question, and it is around large-scale grid-based users and battery storage, associated battery storage demands. Peter, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm first of all, declaring my background. I'm now a retired director of BIFA, and I carried out considerable research through the landfill tax credit scheme into co-located energy loads. And I just wondered if the panel had a view about the logic of co-locating renewable sites around big user energy nodes, such as data centers, and similar sort of setups, airports and so on, and developing a legal framework where there are bilateral loads. So you just cut out the grid completely. The advantage of that process, of course, is that you're not selling off-peak electricity at giveaway prices to the grid, who apply their markup. And equally, you are entering a market where those people are used to paying so-called retail prices, even if they're Tesco, Sainsbury's, and the big distribution centre owners. So, I mean, clearly that doesn't apply to many estates, but in a significant number of setups in the West Midlands, for instance, around the M1, there are surely legal opportunities in putting those two parties together.
Yeah. Ed, I'm going to come to you on that. It seems obvious to me, but an obvious way for the market to go to me. But I mean, what are the issues?
I think it is obvious, Julie, and it's one of those things that makes perfect sense to do. There are some pitfalls in relation to it. So we've been involved, for example, with solar schemes that have been linked into sort of big pumping stations for statutory undertakers, where they've got high energy demand and they've got a private wire, so a single wire connecting one to t'other, so it's exclusive use. And that works because that end user is effectively funding the capex, capital expenditure, for the scheme and then taking the energy, and there is a clear commercial way to make that operate successfully. I think in relation to BIFA, say, or large mines, minerals operators, distribution warehousing, etc., if the user is big enough and it's standalone for that end user, that is more straightforward. Where it becomes more complicated is if you were looking at, say, distribution warehousing with a multi-let big shed development going up the M1, for example, and you wanted to recharge the electricity to the end tenants, because you then come into some potential issues around freedom of supply to those end tenants. So where we've been involved in those schemes before, we've effectively had to double up on the energy supply arrangements so that they could get from the grid as in default, and from the developer or a standalone entity which has been set up to provide electricity to the development. So I think it's a developing market, and increasingly it's perhaps something that prospective tenants or purchasers will look for, where they've got high energy demands. Having something on site will make that site more attractive, and it will probably make it more attractive through the planning process as well. But it's not without complication. The other thing I just mentioned is kind of at the opposite end of the scale. So Peter's asking about schemes which are co-located, developed, providing electricity to probably a fairly nearby site which is taking the electricity. We are also getting involved in some schemes where they use a process called sleeving, which effectively means that you could have electricity being generated in Scotland and being utilised by somebody down on the south coast, and that's not specifically that electricity, but that is electricity being exported onto the grid and then taken off the grid and deemed to be the electricity generated from that particular supply. There's all sorts of issues with that, which I'm sure Peter's live to, and it's not the same as having control over the commercial arrangements in the way that you would with a private wire. I just think it's interesting that issue of trying to get green energy from one place to another place is being looked at from different angles.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Harry? No, Harry. No, Harry. We've got the tech letting us down there. So, Peter? Thank you very much for your question. Did Ed tackle it?
Sorry. Yes, the other point, of course, is that battery technology is coming ahead by leaps and bounds, and the other driver in that process, I suspect, is also the tremendous emphasis on the CSR agenda within large corporates, particularly the food retailers. So you see this increasing appetite on the demand-led side. So good luck with it.
Yeah,
I think that's spot on, Peter. There are tech challenges, commercial challenges, legal challenges, but the increasing focus on corporate social responsibility elements is leading demand in some ways. And then the tech, in terms of the improvements to battery technology, means that it's more viable if you've got a frozen food packing facility, say, and you need the supply to be more constant. Solar or wind with the droppages makes it more complicated because you've got to balance with grid supply. If you've got batteries on site, it gives you more flexibility. So there are lots of different, we could probably talk about this for the whole hour and a half, but there are lots of different factors pushing towards doing more local or specific energy arrangements.
Great, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Peter, for that interesting question. Slightly sort of left field there, but an obvious question to ask, really.
Can I just jump in, Julie, before we move off?
Yeah.
Before we move off the subject, Peter's absolutely right in terms of the sort of appetite amongst big corporates to start integrating sort of green energy projects into their sites and developments. I think that the thing I would add, link back to what I mentioned as under the policy at the start, and in terms of how we're moving away from sort of conventional or traditional fossil fuel supplies onto green technologies, is actually retrofitting green technology into existing operations is actually quite a bit harder than actually integrating renewable technology into new developments. So I think we're seeing a lot of activity, behind the meter activity, particularly around new development sites. However, and whilst there is the interest there about using land adjacent to existing commercial or industrial sites and feeding that power back into those, there are the complications that Ed's alluded to that make it quite complicated to do that, and hence where sleeving comes in and other things. But that's a sort of whole other topic. So
okay, so guys, if we just pull you back in now to the landowner there, and he's had the knock on the door, and we've got he may or may not have signed an exclusivity agreement, a letter of authority. I just want to just give us a basic idea before we look at actually heads of terms and the sort of numbers from the valuation side, the kind of rents that can be expected, but just give us some idea of how these deals are structured. Do I let my land? Is it a joint venture? Is there an option involved? I just wonder if I know there's there is a typical transaction, but there are many variations. But Mary, would you like to just say, in a sense, the steps in terms of the structure of a deal and how it would work with the developer and the landowner?
So typical structure would involve an option granted to the developer for a term of between 2 and maybe 8 years, increasing perhaps dependent on planning time frame and the grid time frames, and at which point, once everything's in place, the developer would be able to exercise that option and take the grant of a lease over the land, which would normally be for a period of about 30 years, often with extension periods further 10 years, and it would be on a kind of acreage basis, with various rights over your retained land in respect of kind of access easements and cable easements, or those might be over third party land, as Harry mentioned earlier. So that would be the typical structure. Okay,
so basically we've got landowner signs, decides he wants to do a deal with that developer and talk to that developer. He signed the exclusivity, letter of authority, developer's gone off to try and get the grid connection sorted in the scenario we're looking at. We can then expect documentation, which is draft documentation that grants the developer an option to take a lease, a long-term lease, 30 years, maybe potentially we can see them extending a little bit from what I understand in terms of some of the lease lengths. And so that is the basic structure. Now, where within that do we deal with, before they grant us the option for the lease and we know the length of term, there should be some heads of terms at the beginning and some negotiations, and that's presumably where the valuers and the agents come back in. We're going to try Harry again and say, Harry, can you, when you does the developer present heads of terms and then you work through them with the client to negotiate points? And what sort of things do they contain? Decommissioning at the end of the 30-year period, right to renew. Can you just talk us through those a little bit?
Can you hear me, first of all?
No, Harry, we can't. So I'm going to hand straight over to Darren, your colleague. Darren,
yeah,
just take us through that.
Thanks, Julie. So yeah, what do heads of terms contain? I don't want to teach people to sort of suck eggs on this, but specifically on the sort of energy schemes, I think the sort of the key areas are obviously around sort of tenants' rights and what you are enabling them to do. I think in terms of the, property demise that you're leasing them, that has some quite sort of key tax implications and something to be wary of. So in the instance of a wind farm, you're only wanting really to grant them a lease over the footprint of the turbine foundation and crane pads, whereas the accesses to the turbines would be rights of way. So you retain that agricultural primary agricultural use and for inheritance tax purposes. And then you come on to the standard clauses like in indemnity. You want to make sure that as the landowners are sort of fully indemnified on these projects, and then very much it's you're covering off all the eventualities which might happen in the future. So and you've got to look at all the different sort of best and worst case scenarios, and then coming to the end of the lease, termination rights, decommissioning provisions, and whether and who's paying for what, whether there's a bond in place or whether the equipment is transferring back to the landowner at the end of the lease term.
Great, Ed. On decommissioning, can you just make your point as well that you'd like to jump in with? But on decommissioning, my question is, what's the usual way of dealing with that and making sure that the panels are, you're not just left with a field of rusting tech at the end of the 30-year lease?
So, funnily enough, decommissioning was the thing I just jotted down to mention. If I can just do 2 steps back first. I think on the structural point about an optional lease, that is completely market standard, and any deviation from that is quite difficult to achieve. We have, and I think Fisher German have as well, some experience of trying to create a structure which more closely resembles a joint venture between landowner and tenant, so that the income being derived could be classified as trading income rather than investment income for tax reasons, which we'll probably come on to. But that has been very difficult, primarily because of the nature of the fund. So part of the reason you end up with an optional lease is with an amount paid per acre, probably with a review in line with indexation rather than market values, is because that provides certainty over a period to an end fund who can purchase, whether it's a pension fund or equity, whatever it might be. And that's what they like about the schemes. There is a higher degree of certainty in relation to the amount of rent that's being paid out over the scheme life from that perspective. In terms of the heads of terms, the thing that we spend probably most of our time discussing with developers, lawyers, when we're acting for landowner, are the decommissioning arrangements, alienation, so the ability for the tenant to sell on the project, and the indemnity. And they are all interlinked, and they are all different to the arrangements that you would expect under standard 1954 Act landlord and tenant commercial lease. So it's hard to talk about any one of them without talking about 3, but I don't want to spend hours going on about it. Part of the issue with solar and renewables generally in terms of structuring is there is a desire from developers to be able to trade the assets, because they treat them almost as an investment generating an income rather than something they're trading from. That means that they want more freedom in the alienation clause to be able to buy and sell the asset, sell it on to someone else, pension fund, etc. That means that the ability for a landowner to assess the covenant strength of their tenant is more difficult, because they are typically housed within special purpose vehicles. So each site will have one company as tenant, and that tenant will only own that particular site. That raises the question, well, once you've finished generating electricity, you've got no more income coming in. How are you going to pay for the decommissioning obligation? Because the obligation in the lease will be put upon the tenant to decommission and return the land to agricultural use. So the way in which that's typically dealt with is to set up some form of decommissioning fund, bond, security, etc. And the arguments are then around how much is going in, when it's going in, who can access it, how the account's held, etc. And because as schemes get bigger, the decommissioning costs get higher and higher, and we also don't know how much they're going to be, there's a lot of work to be done around that to try and protect the landowner as best as possible. The final point on that is the indemnity under these arrangements. We will try and ensure that the landowner is indemnified as far as possible, but it is normal in the industry for developers to push quite hard for certain exclusions. So they would like a cap on the indemnity. They would like economic loss, pure economic loss, to be excluded from the indemnity. So that brings us back onto the decommissioning security arrangements, because actually the indemnity, while as full as possible, will have some holes in it. The alienation won't allow you to assess necessarily the tenant covenant strength in the way you might ordinarily. So decommissioning becomes really, really important as the sort of backstop position for landowners. You've had terms, they've been generating electricity, making money. You've got some security because they're making money. When they stop making money and they've still got material obligations, that is your fallback to say, okay, well, if you haven't complied, I can sue you, but you're a man of straw now. But actually, we've got this pot of cash available. Yep. So that is really critical from a landowner perspective.
Yeah, I can see that needs careful work. Ed, you talked about the joint venture approach, which keeps the landowner trading. Obviously, that's music to my ears as someone who does joint ventures between landowners. But presumably at that point, there's no grant of lease, there's no legal interest in land being obtained by the developer of the renewable energy project, or could there still be within that?
Yes, there could be, and there probably would be, Julie. So if it was Julie Robinson owning land, the joint venture might be the grant of a lease to Julie Robinson as a shareholder in whatever corporate entity or LLP entity it might be. Yeah. The reason I think that route hasn't been pursued, as far as I'm aware, with many sites at all across the country, is the funders don't really like it, because they're looking to purchase the whole of the income and to take the whole equity stake in the SPV. If they've then got to go and speak to the landowner for a pension fund, they're buying into a joint venture structure where they've got a partner rather than buying an investment asset where they've got control over it through the shareholding.
Yeah, very clear. Very clear. You can completely see why it's not attractive, and it's actually something I'm thinking about on another, long-term kind of share farming deal that I'm doing, is creating that separate structure, but it makes it less attractive if one of the parties is thinking of selling on in the future, and taking the company and business to market.
Julie, can I just jump in and add to what Ed has said as well in terms of those sort of three key clauses within the sort of lease, but obviously covered off within the heads of terms. And from a commercial perspective, as Ed's alluded to, there's really sort of two types of developers out there. There's the developer that wants then to be an owner operator of the project, but there's a developer that's there to purely come in at the front end, get all the permissions, and then flog the site on, to put it frankly. So in terms of the alienation clause, very often the developer will want the right to be able to assign the terms or assign the optional lease to a new party if they want to sort of get out of the project. So we would typically, as an agent, look to introduce an assignment payment. So a payment at the point of assignment from the developer across to the landowner, because again it's that causes a nuisance for the landowner. They don't know who their next tenant is going to be, so we would look to introduce an assignment payment. On the decommissioning point, which is a big one, because we are talking about what is likely to happen in 15, 20, 30 years time, depending on what that technology is. So it's important to build a review provision into the decommissioning clause. So you're reviewing what the cost is to decommission and reinstate the site over the period of the lease. So typically we would look to do that, say, on a sort of 5-yearly cycle. to see how the world has moved on during that period. We can revise the costs and work out who's going to be funding that decommissioning bond. And then on the insurance, the other point there is, and what developers will typically try and do is to try and sort of limit their exposure. They will give you a sort of an aggregate figure for insurance coverage, typically between sort of £5 or £10 million. But it's important that that is on a per claim basis, because obviously, again, the world is always moving on, and we live in a very sort of litigious world now, and you know, where everyone sues everyone.
Yes, Ed, and then I want to just come to values.
Yeah,
and then tax.
I'll be really quick, Julie.
Yep.
I was just pondering while Darren was talking. I think on all these points, the devil really is in the detail. So when we talk about assignment provisions or an assignment fee being paid to the landowner when there's an assignment, well, it's often the case that actually ownership is transferred via a change in shareholder, but the SPV company is the same. So when we're doing our drafting, we have to think through those scenarios where it's not an assignment, it's a share transfer. Can we control the share transfers, etc., and get the same payments? And then the same is true on the decommissioning front. You know, who's going to undertake it? Which estimate do we take? But also things like is the valuation, so the estimated cost of decommissioning, is that net of scrap value, or you know, do we assume no value to the scrap when we're doing the decommissioning works? Can the tenant dip into that pot to undertake their works, because otherwise they've got to raise two lots of cash, one to do the works, and then they get the other one back once they've finished decommissioning. Now, from a landowner perspective, we've got a clear preference, but from a developer perspective, they're saying, well, I'm tying up a large sum of cash out of cash flow for no particular benefit to me other than security for the landowner. And then I've got to raise another amount to actually fund the decommissioning before I get that amount back in. And if they're winding down the SPV, that creates a lot of cash at the end, which they don't really want. So it's the sort of intricacies of those arrangements that we end up spending too much time probably talking about, but they are important.
Yes, well, they certainly are 25, 30 years down the line when things come to a head. So, and you know, I'll be retired, so I don't need to worry about them. So that's okay. We've got a question in here that brings us to values, which is what I want to talk about. So Tim Atkinson has asked, are you aware of any assignment payments which are substantial, for example, linked to a percentage of the sale price being achieved, which requires a certain amount of disclosure there of what that sale price is. So that's the question. So question is about assignment payments being substantial. And the second question that everyone wants to know, if you're a landowner, is, you know, how much rent an acre am I going to get for 25, 30, 35 years? You know, where are values at the moment? So I guess with Harry out of action, because I think he is out of action, Darren, I'm going to chuck that to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for the question. I think I personally am not aware of any assignment payments linked to essentially the value of the sale. I think, you know, I think if we tried to negotiate that into a deal, I think it would be met with a high level of resistance from the tenant party, on the basis that I think they may struggle to fund the project if, you know, certainly not to say that it couldn't be done, but I think they would. I think it would cause them financing issues. So generally speaking, when I was referring to assignment payments, that was, you know, they're typically sort of nominal sums, and it's just recognizing the sort of the uncertainty that it's creating for the landlord party. So they tend to be typically sort of £10,000 per assignment type level. So hopefully that covers that.
Quite modest then.
Yeah, quite modest.
You know, inconvenience. Yeah,
I think it's recognizing the fact that it might have, you know, that the assignment might happen, but I think I think our focus would always be getting the terms of the deal
Yep.
right, because that's what's going to earn the landlord the the real money. So
Yep.
so that's that. In terms,
I just saw Ed put his hand up. Did you want to say something on assignment while you're then going to tell us how much we can bank, Darren?
Yeah, only just to, I mean, our experience is exactly the same as Darren's. A fixed sum, perhaps a fixed sum subject to indexation on the assignment fee is all we've really seen. If Tim, anyone can be persuaded to agree to a percentage or a share out of the disposal value, I guess my only real comment would be, it's a couple of points, but we'd have to make sure that we had access on an open book basis to see the data. And we'd also want to ensure that there wasn't any disguised consideration being held outside of the sort of sale contract arrangements. So it's not unusual for a developer to sell off a project to a fund but retain or be granted back an operation and maintenance contract or an asset management contract. And I think you would find, if you could get over the concept of that with a developer, which, as Darren says, I think they would struggle with, you would then be you'd be into some nitty-gritty discussions around what actually qualifies as consideration for the transfer as opposed to consideration for ongoing services.
Great.
And anything else which they might be being paid for.
Got it. So Darren, how much can we earn then through letting our land for renewable energy? I mean, we're looking at all sorts of storage and
sure. So so clearly there's site by site variations, but typically when we're seeing sort of deals coming forward in the solar sector at the moment, which is for very large schemes, you're probably looking at somewhere between £850 and £1,000 an acre for solar sites. And Harry, if you think your microphone's back on, feel free to jump in. The other activity, there's a lot of activity in the battery storage markets at the moment. So this is typically battery storage facilities being located adjacent to existing network infrastructure, and for those projects, you might be looking at anywhere between sort of 1,000 and £2,500–3,000 per megawatt, I would suggest. So that's on a different typically we look at a different on a per megawatt basis rather than a per acre basis. You do get offers coming forward on a per acre basis, but depending on the site design, you can that can be configured to favour the developer if you agreed on a per acre basis. So we'd be looking at what is the capacity of the scheme.
Great. We've got some questions coming in, which bring us on to tax, but I just want to deal with a couple of factual sort of questions first. Rateability and our rates charged on solar land used for solar panels. That's in from James Padley. Do they attract business rates, and at what level? Because that all goes into the mix of payments, but obviously it's for the tenant to pay, presumably there, who's taken the lease. But I think it's a yes, isn't it?
Yeah, there's changes going on. Business rating is a big factor in the decision making process of certainly whether you're self-investing in energy. But there's we had actually some correspondence with the VOA only a few weeks ago inquiring on this topic. So essentially renewable energy generations which generate power primarily for self-consumption will from 2023 be exempt from business rates. Whereas if you're a net exporter of electricity, then those systems will continue to be rateable. So there are changes coming in, because I think the VOA have recognised the fact that at the moment the system is sort of putting people off investing in PV.
So that's actually good news, James, on the self-investment side and use of that renewable energy yourself. Mary, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to jump back to kind of the value of the rents as well, and just touch on.
Well, can you also deal with the question that's come in from Tim Banks, which is, are we seeing turnover rent introduced?
That
as well
was
as
exactly the
ground
point
rent?
I was going to jump back to.
Super,
Yes.
super.
Yes, so there's also an element of turnover rent, often in solo leases particularly, which is a percentage of the profit, the gross profit made from the project. We're typically looking, and Darren and Harry, correct me if I'm wrong, around 5%, 5 to 6% at the moment, and that comes as an additional rental payment. So it's not 6% plus the rent. If the 6% is higher than what the base rent that you'd be paid for, you get the difference as an additional rent payment. So yes, there is an element of turnover rents when it comes to solar leases as well.
Brilliant. And just John Twiddle just confirming that incomes are per year when you talk about them, Darren. When you say 800 an acre or 850 an acre, we mean a year per year.
Yeah, per acre per year. Yeah.
Yep.
Is my microphone working at all?
Oh, Harry, we've
Harry.
got you back. Excellent.
Sorry,
But it's
sorry,
okay.
sorry.
It's okay, Harry. We're coming on to tax.
I've got a bit of catching up to do now, haven't I?
You have.
Yeah, just on turnover rents, my view is it's really, really important to have them in there. And as Mary says, it's the higher of that base rent or a percentage if that is higher. But I think from landowners' point of views, they need to base their decisions on the rate per acre because that's what they know they're going to get, and it needs to be inflation linked from the date of the option. And so they make their decisions there, but you need that turnover rent in there because if, for example, the off-taker, so let's talk about a solar park quickly here, and they've got their off-taker, they're going to sell, the tenant is going to sell the power via a PPA, a power purchase agreement, to that off-taker. And that could be a corporation somewhere far off, could be Google, whoever. And they're going to basically do this deal, which facilitates the building of the solar park project. And they might agree a deal, at a rate per megawatt hour. They buy the power, that off taker, and it might be it's typically between 7 and 15 years. So let's just say it's a 10-year deal, and that percentage, may not come in. But in 10 years' time, when that tenant goes to sort of renegotiate the power purchase agreement, if electricity price inflation has far outstripped CPI, for example, because the PPA agreement is based on CPI, so it'll rise a little bit perhaps each year, but out there in the market, electricity price inflation could fly. They do a new deal, and then they might not be, but the passing rate might be £60 a megawatt hour, for example, but they suddenly do a new deal after 10 years at £80 a megawatt hour. Their revenue, that tenant, their revenue suddenly jumps up, and that could happen, and therefore you as a landowner, you're going to be fine with your tenant earning a bit more money, so long as you get a piece of the action, essentially. So that's your opportunity to then, the percentage might kick in and be higher than the base rent, and then you get a top up. And it might happen at year 10, it could have happened at year 20, we don't know, because we don't know where energy prices are going, we don't have a crystal ball. But it's really important to have it in there to sort of safeguard that and give you an opportunity to earn more money. Ed, you wanted to...
Ed, and then Ed would need to get to the tax question. We've got some questions in, but
it was only really just to draw a comparison between a typical commercial lease where you've got a rent review pattern to open market and a solar or renewables lease, because in a commercial letting market, it would be highly unusual to have a rent set now to run for 35 years, subject to indexation review, but not subject to reference back to the market. So the turnover rent isn't a direct rent review in line with market values, but it does mean there is some correlation between the amount of money being generated by the tenant and the amount of rent being paid by the landlord. So I think you're right, Harry, that's a critical point from a landowner perspective.
Great. So let's just come back to, so we're looking at that sort of commercial deal there. I'm going to have to move on to tax, guys, because we're having the questions in. So we've got the landowner, and he's looking at the commercial deal with the developer, but at the same time, behind the scenes, and I know this is none of our specialism here, behind the scenes, he's having to do some calculations and thought about how to arrange this in the best way in terms of capital taxes, both capital gains and IHT. Mark, I wonder if you could unmute Tom Hindmarsh so that, Tom, you can pitch in with your question or indeed your comment. Comments welcome as well as questions. Hi, Tom. You're just being unmuted if you'd like to pitch in.
Right, can you hear me?
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, yeah, no, well, my question was, and yeah, you're quite right, Julia. I sort of made the observation it's important to consider if the solar land needs to be put into separate legal entity to preserve the IHT reliefs. And this needs to be done before any uplift in value from planning, before any legally binding agreements are signed. And but my pitch on that was, when do the panel consider that should be done whilst not wanting to waste the landowner's money on restructuring and time and everything else? It's kind of where that project looks like it's happening, but we haven't actually got a definite, there's a bit of a risk there, isn't there?
Yeah, and actually we had a discussion about this morning earlier on, and about what the right time for what is. And I'm going to come to, I mean, I think it's probably Ed and Darren who are going to decide this, but as a general point in terms of tax planning, Ed, when does it happen? Does it have to happen before you sign up your option, for example, so that your right parties are in there, or can you get that sorted out? And the second thing is, are we going to hive this off into a separate legal entity?
So I think there are two sort of questions in there, Julie, in terms of the timeline. When should you think about it? The answer, we're risk averse as lawyers, as soon as you can, because the sooner you start to think about it, probably the better. I think Tom's point is a really good one, in that actually it's quite hard to pitch the precise right time, because, and Darren will comment on this, what you're trying to do is do your tax planning before you get too high a value attributable to that land, and you get value through the progression of the process. So you get grid available, you get planning granted, that's a critical one, and you get other things lined up. If you've got the lease granted and it's built out and it's up and running, that's the point where you've got the most inflation in value, probably, because that's the start of the income period. The flip side of that is, until you've actually got it built out, up and running, or at least the lease granted, you haven't got certainty that it's going to go ahead. So my comment, and it's difficult on taxation issues because everything's very specific on sites, but I would think about it as soon as possible. In terms of the transfer to a new entity or grant of a head lease, etc., what we would usually try and do is to carve out that ability under the option arrangement, and that's usually not too much of an issue with developers, to be actioned as it becomes clearer that it's going to get planning, but before the grant of planning, because of the inflation in capital values. The only other point I just make really quickly before we get to Darren on those valuation points, if you raise it early with the developer, you've got a better prospect of them pushing their hand in their pocket to pay for the tax advice and any ancillary transfers. And as the schemes get bigger, we're seeing more developers willing to do that, rather than just saying it's a landowner issue, it's landowner taxation. So by raising it early, you can get a bit of initial advice, but you can also try and push the point about, we want you to pay the cost of this. Because if the scheme doesn't come off, and I think this is the point that Tom's also alluding to, you've sunk cost and effort from the landowners without the reward. So even if you have to concede that those monies will be paid by developer and offset in some way against rent or future payments, at least then they're only being offset when the scheme goes ahead.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Darren,
can I just say something else, Julia?
Yeah, of course, Tom.
Yeah, no, so I get that, and I think one of the really key things is you don't end up with a structure if it didn't come off, which you didn't want. So you've moved a load of land and it's sitting in another company, and you really are in a mess. And the other thing I think is, you've got to think, if you do need to set up a separate entity to put the solar land into, is that you make sure that the right people own it. So if you're thinking of passing it down a generation, you make sure that they're the shareholders. But there can be issues there, I know, because some people don't want to let go of that. So you really got to think long and hard about how you want to set it up if you do need a new entity.
Yeah, Tom,
not just about the tax.
Yeah, thanks for that point, Tom. It's also coming up that question in these long-term biodiversity net gain agreements and projects as well about, you know, who owns that, how we get the benefit to the next generation. And in fact, John Cheney asked a question before the session about IHT planning and, you know, handing down before you ever get to the project. But Darren, just very sort of quickly, what are those points where valuation jumps in this whole process? Where do we see the valuation leaps in this process?
Yeah, okay. So I think Ed's probably touched upon that already. So it's value is a function of risk and return ultimately. So when valuing an energy project, you're normally looking at the sort of investment method evaluation. So you will produce a discounted cash flow and apply a yield to the income over a period of time to to give you your value. But the key components, are very much grid and planning permission. As time passes, and as Mary's alluded to, in terms of the sort of option time frames for many of these projects, as time passes, obviously the tenant will be doing their surveys, doing their investigations, and the picture is becoming clearer all the while as to the likelihood of success of planning. But if planning is achieved and if grid is secured, then really at that point is your first jump in the value of a site, and then obviously you have your risk attached to the actual physical sort of build and development out of the site. So again, the value is increasing all the while as that unfolds, and then your optimum value is really sort of your optimum value is probably sort of 12 months into the operation of the scheme, when you have some real tangible data as to how it's performing. So if it's a wind farm or if it's a solar park, we all can make our projections as to what the developer's returns and therefore ultimately what the landowner's return might be. So physical evidence of performance of a scheme, optimizes that value. But obviously, over the lease term is going to, the over 15, 20, 40 year lease, whatever it may be, is the longer of that period left, then the more value there is in that scheme. But I think coming back to just Tom's point, it is a really key one, because tax can be something that actually derails the deal. There can be enough of a taxation argument to actually for a landowner not to progress a project. So I think taking that advice early, understanding the different eventualities is key, without actually potentially going the whole hog and making that sort of ownership restructure. Because like you say, until there's certainty there and that it's actually going to happen, you don't necessarily want to create yourself a problem by transferring ownership into an entity.
Thanks. Okay, we've got some quick questions coming in, so thanks everybody for that quite lively and interesting questions. So I'll just fire these through rather than just follow our next point. So it's quick question for you, Harry. You're probably most plugged into this, so to speak, but what's your view on how long it will take for battery technology to be good enough to cover likely demand on a site able to use its own electricity? So if it uses 1 megawatt, would you need to generate 2 megawatts during the day to meet overnight demand with, say, 1 megawatt? So it's about timescales. How quickly is the tech moving on this?
I don't really have an answer for that question. Tech is moving quickly, but that's probably a little bit too technical for me, to be honest. I'm sort of looking after landowners, interest on the ground, trying to get them the best rents and make sure decommissioning is in place. And I don't really have an answer for that. But one thing, while I have got the conch, so to speak, is that I'm seeing a couple of questions about whether turnover rent is coming in as well, like a solar park or a wind farm, and it's developers for battery schemes are resisting that, and it is always asked for, but I am meeting resistance from them to that mechanism. You're probably more likely to get a rent based on the hire of a rate per acre, being a very high rate, or installed capacity, megawatts. But Ed and Mary, you may say, actually, we've seen, that there was resistance, but now that's creeping in with certain developers, getting a percentage turnover in there. It's certainly always something I ask developers, but they do resist it. What do you find there?
Mary?
No, I agree there, especially in single battery storage facilities where it's co-located. It's often more of a discussion point about kind of the definition of the gross revenue of the project, especially when it comes to the differences between import and export battery and load shifting battery. So, but it generally comes with quite a lot of resistance, but it's always one that's trying to get in there. But
Great, Ed.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think we've got a couple where we've got it. One of the, again, devil in the detail points about turnover rent is where we've got co-located sites. So we've got a mixture of solar and potential battery storage. There are attempts by developers to exclude battery income from the turnover rent. And again, the definition of gross revenue for that purpose, to work out what you're putting in your bundle before you apply your percentage, is really critical, because there's lots of stuff they'll try and sneak out of it, or deliberately get out of it.
If they're paying a separate rent, though, there's
yeah. So they're paying a separate rent, Harry. And I think on co-located ones, you've got some protection from the turnover on the solar elements. The point I was just trying to make was on a co-located battery solar scheme, if the developer is pushing not to pay turnover on the battery element, we've had some very long discussions with developers about how they are actually going to meter that. So from a technical perspective, you've got energy coming in from the grid into the battery, and you've got energy coming from the solar into the battery, and then it's being sold. And obviously you can't say, well, that unit of electricity went in from the solar at this point, it's got that value, and this came in from the other side, and then correspond that to when the units are being sold off. So there's a risk, unless we are careful, that some of the solar generated electricity being pushed through the battery storage site is in a grey area about whether or not it falls into the turnover. And I don't think we have, as an industry, got to a particularly settled position in relation to how we deal with that. And the conversations I've had with developers, there's been quite a lot of shrugging of shoulders, and they're not really sure on the technical solution.
Great. Okay, just zooming out from that quite technical
yeah, sorry, Julie.
issue. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I'm sure everyone will be fascinated by, and you're showing a lot of your workings, guys, which I appreciate. The real sort of nitty gritty of the discussions. But pulling it out a little bit, we've got a question from Michael Campion. Michael, would you like to ask your question if we unmute you? That's great. Michael, fire away. It's about planning and opposition.
Can you hear me, Julie?
Yes, indeed, Michael.
Yeah, well, my question is, do the panel think, with all the current applications for large-scale solar panel farms going in at the moment, that the government is going to have to change its opinions on the planning procedures regarding national significant infrastructure projects, etc., where at the moment I am actually involved as a tenant farmer in a very large scale solar development in its early stages. Public opinion with national campaign groups at the moment is becoming very, very strong. And their main argument is that for solar panels to work properly, they need to be on a large scale, which obviously takes agricultural land out of production. With the turmoils on the continent with Russia, Ukraine, food production is going to become, or could become, a major problem. I'm just wondering what the panel thought on what the government might be persuaded to do.
Thank you, Michael. It's not just solar either. Obviously, we have other, we've got the whole woodland debate and all the rest of it. But just thinking about renewable energy and solar in particular, which is the one that takes up space, and possibly battery storage too. Panel, what do you think? I mean, you know, how are we going to deal with this?
Shall I go, Julie?
Yeah, go on, Ed.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a really excellent question, and it's not a very easy one to necessarily see a way through. I think there's obviously pressure from the green perspective and the funding that we spoke about earlier. But when we talk about potential issues on the continent and security of food supply, which I think is really important, there are corresponding pressures on security of energy supply. So it's really a question about balancing those priorities. I think I personally, and it's only a personal opinion, I have some concerns about the NSIP scheme and the size of the schemes going through, because politicians, irrespective of sort of those weighted arguments, primarily want to get re-elected, and public opinion is therefore really important. And solar has enjoyed, certainly if it's not in someone's local area, it's enjoyed quite high levels of public support. I think there's a risk that starts to dwindle if we start to see 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 acres as blocks coming forward in areas that are perhaps good for grid, but not necessarily good in terms of visibility or how they're affecting the local environment. So I appreciate that's not really an answer to the question, but I think A, there's a balancing act on the actual policy side of things between different things, and B, if we get too many that are too big in poorly chosen locations, I think there is a risk that public perception falls and politicians tend to follow that.
Great. Go on then, Harry.
No, just I think it's a brilliant question, and I've been thinking about it too. And you're sort of thinking, when at what point is there just such saturation that people say this is enough? And there's controversial schemes near Cambridge. There's the Daily Mail, and John Nettles getting upset about one in Devon, and it's bringing some negative press reports. And you know, as Ed says, solar has enjoyed. It is popular overall, but for how long? Because we know I'm dealing with developers and landowners all the time, and the pipeline is massive, and we are tipping the iceberg. Some of these projects that are out there in the public domain, they're a fraction of what's coming. So
Great.
I think
so that brings us on to the next sort of issue, which is multifunctionality of these sites. And we know, so we mentioned at the beginning the requirement for biodiversity net gain of a minimum of 10% on planning on developments. So there's a requirement, presumably, which affects solar sites and wind or battery storage sites, just like any other development. But presumably there is also an opportunity for the unused parts and the parts under the panels to actually be producing biodiversity net gain and to be able to be used to offset someone else's development. I wonder if someone would like to talk through whether you're having a discussion about this with your developers, with your landowners. For me, it's quite exciting if we can actually address some of those. It's not so much a food security issue. We've got the sheep grazing point, but it's about actually doing more than simply generating energy from land. If we can also increase biodiversity, we're helping to sell solar better. But does someone want to comment, Harry? Do you?
Well, I've got a few observations. Actually, a site that's got planning consent were active for the landowner. And interestingly, the ecology surveys sort of highlighted well along as it was in farmland and did a point system, and then put the assumption that all the biodiversity elements were coming as part of that planning, and it had an extra sort of 20% biodiversity. We then said, actually, we want some more hedges. This is our opportunity as a landowner to get the developer to do a few things, and a new pond over there, and we got these agreed, and then it went up to 140, so sort of 40% more. So first off, when you take a land out of production, and there is the developers have to do a lot of hedge enhancement and biodiversity work, which is great for the birds and the bees, and that is happening and will happening. And now it's even more topical, and now landowners are interested, well, can I make some extra money out of this? And we don't have all the answers, but what we're trying to do, and I'm talking to the likes of Ed Johnson and Mary, is we want to future proof. So when we're putting some terms in place, we want to establish some principles with the developer, to do with carbon sequestration and natural capital, biodiversity net gain. We don't know quite where it's going, but we're trying to leave it open so that the developers will agree that any benefits that come with the land should stay with the landowner. And we accept as landowner and landowner agents that if it's to do with the energy, that may go with the developer or the tenant. So we're just trying to leave it open, and it's a quick moving, evolving sector. And so we are having these conversations. We don't necessarily have the answers, and there are some, and my concern is if you're just letting the land to a tenant, are you going to actually have any rights to such benefits? And
so that brings us to the legal question, really, and so it's not settled at the moment, Ed. I can see that these are, this is all just being discussed in deals, but I guess it's quite difficult for the landowner to reserve some things from that. I mean, he can't. It's difficult to imagine what reserving carbon looks like, because it's not the same as reserving mines and minerals. But do you want to? What are the issues as you see it, and which way do you think it's going to fall?
I suppose, Julie, from a boring legal perspective, there's a difference between reserving a right to something and accepting something from a transaction. And it's a little bit easier with leasehold to accept something, but with carbon, we're not looking necessarily to sequester it and then come and take it away. So that's not an exception of something physical, which is going to be removed. And reserving a right, well, a right would be to come and take it away rather than a right to have it. I think the key thing is probably more looking at it commercially, where the income goes and who's got control over that. So the things that Harry and I have been working on, we've been looking effectively at setting up a framework to try and work out, if opportunities arise, that the parties will, there's lots of reasonableness and lots of endeavours in there, but will work together to pursue what is viable in the context of what they're doing. And then the question is, who does what and what the share is of any income that's derived from it.
And presumably there's an issue for the ultimate asset owner as well, that they don't necessarily want to be landed with a long-term, what might be, again, 40 years, 50 years, even longer maybe, biodiversity net gain project on the land if they want to do something else with the solar, like collapse it mid-term or something, because prices are...
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It always amazes me when we talk to asset managers or funds who hold sites and we say, well, landowners interested in letting you a bit of land next door for batteries. Would you like to do that to sort of enhance the scheme you've got? And the level of interest is significantly lower than I would have thought it would be. I think because from their perspective, they've bought something with a yield attached to it, particularly if it's a subsidy-based scheme. And anything else beyond that, they're looking to acquire more and get it in and looking at the rates of return on it. They're not necessarily, as asset holders, developers. So they've got it, it's generating an income. Yep. Well, you need a bit of a development arm to start thinking about, well, can I build that there, construct that, etc. So that there is a bit of a dichotomy that doesn't necessarily make sense commercially to me, but I suppose I can see why there is a resistance.
Very good. We're going to close with actually that sort of those next, a very good link. Thank you, Ed, as if we planned it. On sort of the opportunities, once that development, that initial stage of the development is up and running, where are we going? What are the opportunities for add-ons and for sort of, synergistic developments on sites? And Darren, you mentioned EV, electric vehicle charging at the beginning. Do you want to just talk about that and chuck anything in? We've got 2 minutes, guys, so.
Yeah, just so from my perspective, what we're seeing is obviously co-location of batteries onto existing and established renewable energy schemes. You touch upon EV forecourts, and Ed mentioned earlier this. As we transition towards more EVs on the road, that's going to only increase the demand for electricity. We're seeing the rollout of EV infrastructure, and as I mentioned, within the net zero strategy, there's a strong emphasis on that. We've been involved in some deals for EV forecourts supported by renewable technology. So again, if for anyone located near to the transport network, that's definitely one. Also other opportunities out there at the moment as we transition towards renewables, more unstable grid, the need to balance that through batteries, inertia projects. National Grid is running
Great.
Stability
Anything from
Pathfinder
you,
program.
Harry?
Yeah,
Closing?
sure. I'm seeing existing wind farm owners look to share their connection with solar because they dovetail well, and I think that will happen vice versa with solar parks that are built or get built. They will look to have turbines when the planning regime eases up in this country, which we expect it will. Then hybrid projects are, batteries, solar, and turbines. Perfect.
Super. Ed and Mary, anything from you guys? I think. Yep.
Yeah,
Ed.
I mean, there's lots of opportunities, Julie, but in the limited time frame, all I would just add is the market for developing is hot at the moment. There's lots in the pipeline, as Harry said. There's also a very active secondary market. So landowners who are looking to dispose of freeholds subject to solar leases, or just to capitalise on the rental stream. So put a head lease in place, get a capital sum, whatever you need to use it for. So that market is also very active.
Excellent. Okay, folks, we promised we wouldn't go beyond 11:30. Thank you very much, everyone, for being such an active audience and piling in with questions. And I'd really like to thank the panel, Darren and Harry, not twins, from Fisher German, and Ed and Mary from Roythornes. And thank you very much for joining us this morning. Do get in touch directly with any questions, any follow-up comments or questions. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.